Harry, don't remember the last time I had a dream that didn't feel like a curse. The kind of dream where the past comes crawling back with its cold fingers and tightens its grip around my chest. I used to dream of her Abigail when the nights were quieter. Before I learned that dreaming only made it hurt more, there was nothing left for me but silence and the wind. Wind that howled through the mountains like a wounded animal, as if nature itself mourned what I'd lost. For 5 long years, I'd lived in this self-imposed exile. Alone with my thoughts, my grief, and a few hand-carved wolves that never seemed to capture the wildness I once loved, I sat at my table, the flames flickering low in the stone hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin. The walls creaked and groaned, a steady reminder that even the strongest foundations could be worn down. The cabin was small, no bigger than a barn, and yet it felt like a fortress when I stepped inside. I built it myself, not for shelter from the weather, but from everything else. The world, the people, the memories that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The night was deep, the kind of dark that swallowed sound whole. A storm had been brewing all afternoon, thick clouds rolling across the horizon like a sea of steel. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls. A storm in Texas hill country isn't something to take lightly. It can bury a man faster than the ground he walks on. I stood up, grabbing my rifle from the peg by the door, and stepped outside. The chill of the air stung my lungs, but it was the wind that got to you. The relentless wind. It tore at the trees and bent them low, snapping branches with ease. The storm wasn't content to just pass over. It wanted to make a statement. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but there was something else in the air. A tension, an omen. I'd lived long enough in this wilderness to know that the land speaks if you're willing to listen. And tonight, it was screaming. I turned back to the cabin, eyes narrowing against the wind. My horse, Thunder, was restless in the stable, kicking at the walls. I went inside to check on him, but something stopped me before I reached the door. A sound, something out of place, drifting over the howl of the storm. A faint noise like wood cracking. Then the unmistakable sound of a wheel breaking free. My heart jumped. The stagecoach. I grabbed my coat and rushed out, pulling the door closed behind me as the storm seemed to reach its peak. The ground trembled beneath my feet, the snow turning to a blinding white blur. It didn't take long to find the wreckage. It wasn't far just off the trail that cut through the valley below my cabin. The stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily as the horses struggled against their traces, long since frozen in place. The smell of blood and iron cut through the air, mingling with the sharp scent of snow. I stepped forward, rifle in hand, scanning the wreckage. There was no movement, just the dead bodies of the passengers, frozen, lifeless, and still, except for one, a woman. She was half buried in the snow, her face pale, her breathing shallow but steady. Her close-fine wool, torn at the edges, told me she was not a local, not someone who had any business being here in the middle of a storm. I hesitated. I'd sworn off saving anyone. The last time I had, it had cost me everything. This woman. There was something about her that pulled at me. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the fragility of her form, the way the wind whipped through her dark, wet hair, or maybe it was the look of sheer terror that still clung to her closed eyes. I approached carefully, the rifle still in my hands but pointed low, out of respect for her life. I knelt beside her, fingers cold as I checked for a pulse. It was there barely, but it was there. I'd never been much of a healer. I knew just enough to survive, just enough to keep myself from dying in the wild. But this, I couldn't just leave her here. Not like this. Not when there was still hope. I picked her up awkwardly, my heart racing as I carried her back to the cabin. She was light, like a feather caught in the wind. I didn't look back. Didn't want to. All I knew was that my instincts were telling me to get her out of the storm. I laid her down by the fire, the heat of the hearth cutting through the cold that clung to her skin. Her clothes were soaked through with snow and blood, and the last thing I wanted to do was touch her. But it had to be done. My hands shook as I stripped her down, gently removing the layers that stuck to her skin. Couldn't help but notice how delicate she looked, how vulnerable. The scars on her arms, the softness of her cheeks, and the way her lips parted slightly in unconscious sleep. It made me forget myself for a moment. "Just stay with me," I muttered to no one in particular. Though I wasn't sure I was even talking to her, I felt the weight of everything I had buried come to the surface again. And yet, when I looked at her, at the fragile life in my cabin, I felt a stirring that I couldn't explain. A life worth saving. I found some blankets and wrapped her in them, trying to keep her warm. But her shivering wouldn't stop. She wasn't dead, but she was slipping fast. The storm outside seemed to mock me, howling louder, as if daring me to fail. Then she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, the green of her gaze shining like a storm-tossed sea. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible, as if the wind itself had stolen her words. "Where am I?" I didn't know how to answer her, safe for now. She tried to sit up, her hands pushing against the blankets, but I stopped her gently. "Don't. You're hurt." Her gaze shifted around the room, panic creeping into her features as she registered where she was. What are you doing? Why did you bring me here?" I didn't know what to say to that. "You were dying out there," I said, voice rough. "Can't let you freeze." But her confusion lingered, replaced by something else, fear. "Who are you?" I could see the fear in her eyes, and for a moment I felt it too. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, much less who this woman was. But in that moment, in the silence between us, I felt the heavy weight of the world pressing in. And the worst part? I wanted her to stay. I wanted to reach out and hold her in the same way I used to hold Abigail, but I see OULD in single quotes, so I kept silent and let the storm rage outside. It didn't take long for the storm to consume everything. By the time I carried Adelaide into the cabin, the world outside had been swallowed by a white, whirling chaos. Inside, the fire crackled to life, casting long, flickering shadows on the logs of the walls. It felt like the cabin was alive with heat, but my thoughts, every damn one of them, were frozen. I had no business saving her. I had no business holding her like this, warming her fragile body with my own. The last time I had felt this way was with Abigail, her laugh. Her warmth, everything that I had foolishly thought would last forever. But now, all I had was this woman, her life hanging by a thread. I thought about the storm outside, the wreckage, the sound of the wheel breaking, and my gut twisted. Maybe I had dragged her from death only to drag her into something worse. I closed the door, the howling wind quieting behind me. I glanced down at the woman lying on the cabin's rough floor. She was barely conscious, pale as death. Adelaide Turner. I didn't know why her name lingered in my mind. I didn't know why her face haunted me more than it should. I'd seen worse, far worse, than a half-dead woman in the middle of a snowstorm. But something about her eyes, the helplessness in them, something about the way she'd looked at me with fear, the same fear that had once haunted MIT, stirred something I thought was long dead. I knelt beside her, running my hands over her body, checking for injuries. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, a far cry from the wild, steady beats of a healthy heart. But it was there. She was alive. I couldn't walk away. Not now. I worked quickly, removing her soaked clothes, careful to respect the fragile privacy that still separated us. The moment her skin met the warmth of the fire, I noticed the pale scars running across her arms. She had known pain before the storm. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know the story behind those marks. The crackle of the ASE was the only sound, as I wrapped her in a thick buffalo blanket and set to work on getting her warm. I could feel my hands trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. From the weight of the choice I had made. It had been a long time since I'd cared for anyone. Abigail had been the last person I loved. But Adelaide, she was different. She wasn't like the other women I had encountered in this damned wilderness. She wasn't from here, and that was what scared me most. I stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest as I worked. But she stirred suddenly, her eyes fluttering open, the panic clear in her gaze as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where am I?" Her voice cracked like dry wood. I swallowed. "You're safe. I pulled you from the wreck." She tried to sit up, but the movement was slow, labored. "The others, where are they?" I felt the weight of her gaze on me. I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. That the others were dead. That she was alone now. and she would never go back to her life in Boston. "You were the only one I found," I said quietly. She looked around, her eyes narrowing. "You're not. You're not some kind of murderer, are you?" I gritted my teeth. "No, I'm no murderer. I just saved your life. Don't make me regret it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. She seemed to study me then, her gaze softening for a moment before she looked away. She was no fool, I could tell. She saw the hard lines of my face, the weariness in my eyes. She saw the walls I'd built around myself, and if she was anything like me, she knew that the same walls would keep her safe here as much as they'd kept me safe. But in the silence that followed, the storm outside seemed to creep in around us, threatening to take her from me, take her just like everything else had been taken. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, her voice small. "I'm sure you've done enough already. You're no burden," I muttered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, and when she spoke again, I knew I had no way of stopping it. "I don't know where to go now. I don't know what to do." I sat down across from her, leaning against the wall. "You'll stay here. The storm's too harsh. You can't leave." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. For now, the next few days passed in a haze of tending to wounds, feeding her soup and trying not to think about the inevitable. I didn't want to get attached. I didn't want to fall for a woman I couldn't keep. But her eyes, the way she listened to my stories about the land, how she learned how to carve wolves like meese, lowly, awkwardly, but with an intensity I hadn't seen before it, made me feel things I'd long buried. Adelaide didn't just stay out of necessity. She stayed because there was something about this place, about me, that she couldn't leave behind. And that was dangerous. It wasn't long before we had to talk. I was chopping wood outside when I saw her standing by the cabin, staring off into the horizon. She was holding something in her hands, a letter. I set the axe down and walked over to her. "What's that?" She didn't look up, her voice soft. "A letter from Boston. From my family." My heart tightened, but I said nothing. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to know that she might leave me when the storm passed. She finally looked at me. "They're worried. They want me to come back." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't have to go back to that life, Adelaide, I know," she whispered. "But it's not that simple." I could see the struggle in her eyes, the pull between the life she'd left behind and the life she was starting here. But all I could think was that I couldn't lose her not when I'd just begun to let her in. "I'm not asking you to stay," I said, my voice hard, "but you need to decide what you want. And fast." Her eyes met mine, dark with emotion. "I have decided. I choose this. I choose you, Ethan." I could feel my chest tighten as I fought to swallow the knot in my throat. This was it. She had chosen. And now, we had to face what that meant. The next few weeks were filled with the constant rhythm of survival. We rebuilt the cabin together, piece by piece. What had once been a refuge of isolation was becoming something new. A sanctuary, yes, but also a home. A home where love, however fragile, was starting to bloom. But with that love came new challenges. The sheriff arrived one afternoon, his dusty hat low over his eyes as he stepped into the cabin. His voice was gravelly, his tone suspicious. "I'm here about the shooting," he said, his eyes flicking to the door where Richard Payne's men had tried to force their way in. "What happened here?" Adelaide looked at me, and I could feel the weight of the past pressing in on us. The sheriff's questions felt like a threat. But I wouldn't let him tear down what we had built. "We were protecting ourselves," I said, my voice steady. "You know the kind of men Payne has under his thumb. They were here to hurt us." The sheriff watched us carefully, his eyes narrowing as if weighing our words. "I've heard rumors about Payne and his dealings. I don't believe for a second that you're guilty of anything. But I'll need a full statement." It was in that moment that we realized just how deep Richard's influence ran. But in the sheriff's questioning, we also found a small glimmer of justice. With the sheriff's suspicions about Payne's corrupt dealings, our names were cleared. However, Adelaide wasn't out of the woods yet. She still had to face her family, and that, in its own way, would be just as difficult. Days passed. and we slowly adapted to this new life we were carving out of the land and the pieces of our broken pasts. Every day felt like a test, but I felt stronger knowing I wasn't facing it alone. Adelaide had become the heart of this place, turning our cabin into something more than just a shelter. The walls were no longer just wood and stone. They were the foundation of a new beginning. But as spring approached and the weather softened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not done with us yet. Richard Payne was still out there, nursing his bruised pride, and sooner or later, when he'd come for Adelaide again, and when he did, we'd be ready.